Rebecca sat behind the wheel of the old sedan she had rented at the Boston airport, feeling the cold wind off the Atlantic creep through the cracks in the windows, making her wrap herself tighter in the wool scarf she had bought in New York before leaving. The road wound along the coast of Maine, and outside the window she could see low gray clouds hanging over the ocean, where the waves crashed against the rocky shores with such a noise that even through the closed windows she could hear their booming rhythm, a reminder of how life sometimes hits you with waves and never gives you a break. She had been driving for hours, leaving behind the bustle of Manhattan, where her husband, Tom, was probably sitting in his office on Wall Street, looking at endless reports on the financial markets and not thinking about her, because their marriage had long since settled into a routine where conversations were limited to discussing bills and dinner plans with friends they both tolerated out of politeness. Rebecca was a writer. Her last book about women in the corporate world had come out 2 years ago and brought in a good income, but now she was stuck. The words wouldn't come, and she decided that she needed a change of scenery, to go somewhere where no one would bother her, where she could just sit by the window and look out at the sea, trying to find the strength to write a new story that was spinning around in her head, but just wouldn't put it on paper. The town she was headed to was called Harborville, a small, quiet town of perhaps 1,000 people, where the tourists didn't linger in the winter and the locals fished and repaired their boats in preparation for the spring season. She'd found the listing for the cabin on a vacation rental site online and had been immediately drawn to the photo. An old lighthouse on the edge of a cliff, a wooden cottage with a sloping roof covered in snow, and a view of the ocean that promised peace and solitude. This is what I need, she'd thought, sitting in her New York apartment while Tom slept in the next room, and she didn't want to wake him because their conversations lately either ended in silence or arguments about trivial matters, like who forgot to buy milk or why she was working late again. They had been married for 15 years, since they met in college, and at first everything was perfect. He was an ambitious financier, she was a creative soul, but over time his career consumed him completely, and she felt lonely even in their spacious apartment overlooking Central Park. They did not have children, although they tried, and this was another crack in their relationship that they did not discuss. They just carried on, pretending that everything was fine. By the time Rebecca finally pulled into Harborville, the sun was setting, painting the sky dull shades of gray and orange, and she saw what the town looked like in reality. A few streets of wooden houses painted white and blue to withstand the salty wind, a small harbor with boats bobbing in the waves, and a lighthouse standing on a hill like a silent sentinel. The air was thick with the smell of salt, mixed with the scent of the pine trees that lined the road, and the cries of seagulls echoed off the cliffs in the distance. She pulled the car up to the house she was renting, a modest two-bedroom cottage with a kitchen and living room, an old fireplace, and windows that looked out over the ocean. The owner, an older man named Mr. Harris, was waiting at the door with her keys, and he smiled as she stepped out of the car, rubbing her hands together from the cold. "Welcome to Harborville, Mrs. Smith," he said, handing over the keys, his voice rough, with the typical Maine accent that drew out the vowels and made his speech seem slow. "The cabin is ready, there's wood in the shed for the fire, and if anything breaks, call me. It's quiet here in the winter, but the ocean can be loud at night, so get used to it." "Thank you, Mr. Harris," Rebecca replied, taking the keys and looking around. "That's exactly what I'm looking for, some quiet. I hope I can work on my book here." He nodded, not asking any questions, because in towns like this people are used to visitors looking for privacy and minding their own business. "If you need anything from the store, there's the Sea Anchor downtown, it's got everything you need. And the Lighthouse Bar, if you want something to eat or drink, they have the best lobster in the area." Rebecca thanked him and walked into the cottage, where the air was cool but clean, with a slight smell of wood and sea. She laid out her things, a few sweaters, jeans, a laptop, and a stack of notepads. She sat by the window, looking out at the gray waves that rolled onto the shore, crashing against the rocks, and thought about Tom. He had called this morning, asking if she had arrived, but the conversation was short, as it always was lately, without the warm words that had been before. Maybe it's a midlife crisis, she thought. She was 45, and she noticed how her body was changing, the wrinkles around her eyes, the slight tiredness in the mornings, and it made her think about how life was passing her, and she was stuck in a marriage that no longer brought joy. She wanted personal growth, something new, but she didn't know how to find it, and she hoped that here, in this secluded place, the ideas would come on their own. That evening, when hunger began to set in, Rebecca decided to go to the bar Mr. Harris had mentioned. She put on a heavy jacket and walked down the narrow road that led into the center of town, where the streets were lit by a few lanterns and the wind blew tiny snowflakes that melted on her face. The Lighthouse Bar was a small wooden-walled establishment hung with nets and old photographs of ships, and the inside was warm from a crackling log fire. Several locals sat at the bar, sipping beer, and the bartender, a middle-aged woman with short graying hair, nodded to her as she walked in. "What do you want, dear?" the barmaid asked, wiping her glass, and her tone was friendly but not intrusive, like in small towns where visitors are noticed but not pestered with questions. "Hot soup and a glass of wine, if I may," Rebecca replied, sitting down at the counter and looking around. "I just got here, rented a house by the lighthouse." "Oh, you're that writer from New York," said the barmaid, pouring wine. "Mr. Harris mentioned it. My name is Maggie. It's quiet here in the winter, but the people are nice. If you want company, here's Luke. He's a fisherman, knows all about these parts." She nodded toward the man at the end of the bar, a man in his 50s with rough hands calloused from handling ropes and nets and soft blue eyes that looked at her with interest but no pressure. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans and smelled of the sea and tobacco. "Hello," Luke said, raising his glass of beer. "I'm Luke Johnson. I hear you write books. What brings you to our Harborville in the winter? Most people come in the summer when it's warm." Rebecca smiled, feeling the conversation flow naturally, and replied, "I need a break from the city. My husband is busy with work, and I want to focus on my new book. This seems like the perfect place, the ocean, the silence. And you, a fisherman, right? Tell me about the sea. Maybe it will inspire me." Luke chuckled, setting his glass down, and began to speak, his voice low and calm, with the unhurried quality that comes from living by the water. "The sea is my whole life. I go out in a boat every morning, weather permitting, to catch lobster and cod. It's rough in the winter. The waves can capsize a boat if you're not careful, but it's honest it gives if you respect it. Last year, a storm blew away half the dock, but we rebuilt it. And you, Rebecca, what do you write about? Love, adventure?" She nodded, sipping her wine, feeling the tension of the day's ease. "People, relationships. My last book was about women in business, but now I want something personal. You know, sometimes in a marriage there comes a point when you think, is this it? The kids haven't arrived, your husband is busy with his career, and you feel like you're on the sidelines. I hope to figure myself out here." Luck looked at her carefully, and understanding flashed in his eyes. "I was married for 20 years, but we separated 5 years ago. She wanted city life, and I can't live without the sea. Now I live alone with a dog. Family responsibilities are hard, especially when you change with age. I've been thinking maybe it's time to try something new, but at 50, it's not that easy." They talked some more about mundane things, how everyone in the town knew everyone else, the best places to walk along the beach, the way the ocean changed your mood. Rebecca listened, and it felt like a breath of fresh air after her stuffy New York apartment. Luke talked about the storms he had lived through, about the time he had saved a friend who had fallen overboard, and his words were filled with the simple wisdom of a man who lived in the rhythm of nature. She shared her thoughts about the crisis in her marriage, not going into detail, but feeling relieved to say it out loud. "Trust is the foundation," Luck said, finishing his beer. "But once it's gone, it's hard to get it back. I've been wondering if maybe it's better to be alone than to pretend. What about you? Aren't you afraid that being alone here will intensify your thoughts?" "Maybe it will," Rebecca replied. "But sometimes you have to face yourself to grow. There are too many distractions in New York, and here it's just me and the ocean." It was already dark when she left the bar, and Luck offered to walk her to the cottage, but she declined, saying she wanted to walk alone. As she walked along the road, hearing the cries of seagulls and the sound of the waves, she thought about the conversation, about how easy it was to talk to a stranger, and felt a slight excitement that she had not felt for a long time. In the cottage, she lit a fireplace, sat down with her laptop, but instead of writing, she simply stared into the fire, thinking about trust, how age changes priorities, and the moral dilemma of staying in a marriage out of habit or looking for something real. The next day, Rebecca woke to the sound of the wind shaking the windows and went for a walk along the beach, where the gray waves rolled onto the sand, leaving foam and shells. She picked up some pebbles, smooth from the water, and thought about Tom. He would probably be in the office, calling clients, unaware that she had met someone here with whom conversation flowed so easily. When she returned, she tried to write, but the words wouldn't come, so she decided to go to the local grocery store. There, by the shelves with canned goods, she saw Luca again, buying coffee. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "How did you sleep at the lighthouse?" "Noisy, but good," she replied. "The wind is like a lullaby. And you? Have you been on a boat yet?" "Yeah, I caught a couple of lobsters. If you want, I can treat you to some. Come to the bar tonight. Maggie will cook." She agreed, and that evening they met again, this time at a table by the window, where they ate fresh lobster with butter and bread. Luck told her about his daughter, who had gone to Boston to study, and how family responsibilities sometimes weighed on her, but gave her meaning. "I miss her, but I'm glad she's building her own life. And you and your husband, are you planning on having children?" Rebecca shook her head. "We tried, but it didn't work. It hurts less now, but it reminds me that life doesn't always go according to plan. Sometimes I wonder if this is a sign that I need to change." They talked about personal growth, how in midlife you realize time is running out, and you have to choose what's important. Luke shared how after his divorce he started learning guitar, just for himself, and it helped. Rebecca felt a connection, but reminded herself that she was there for the work, not the complication. The days flowed with the rhythm of the town. Mornings by the ocean, trying to write, evenings at the bar with Luke. He showed her places: an old pier where they used to fish, a forest path with pine trees. The topics came up in conversation: social dilemmas, how to balance work and family, moral questions about loyalty. Rebecca called Tom once a week, but the conversations were dry, and she felt guilty but also excited by the new friendship. One evening, after dinner, Luke said, "You seem like a man who is looking for answers. The sea teaches patience. Maybe it will help you too." She nodded, feeling something shift inside her, but she was taking her time. Winter was just beginning, and she knew there was plenty of time to think ahead. Rebecca sat at the old wooden table in the living room of her rental, surrounded by scattered notebooks and a few sheets of paper covered in the scribbled notes she had collected over the years. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the floor, and the ocean was still roaring outside, its rhythm almost familiar to her after a few days in Harborville. On the table lay a box of letters and old photographs she had brought with her, not quite sure why, perhaps to make sense of the past or to find inspiration for a book. She picked up one of the letters, written by Mark, her husband, back when they were just starting to date. Neat handwriting, words about how he dreamed of building a house for them where they would be happy. She had believed those words then, but now, rereading them, she felt only emptiness. The house had been built, but happiness had never settled in it. Mark was an architect, the kind of guy who got his designs published in magazines, and his obsession with his work grew with each passing year. At first, Rebecca had admired it: his passion for drawing, his late-night sketching, his conversations about how buildings could change people's lives. But over time, she began to feel out of place in his world, where drawings and clients took up all the space. Their conversations grew shorter and their nights grew colder, even when they slept in the same bed. She tried to talk to him about it, but he brushed it off, calling it creative block and suggesting that she take a vacation or take yoga. Rebecca didn't want yoga. She wanted him to look at her the way he used to, but he was too absorbed in his projects to notice that she was drifting away. She opened her laptop, trying to start a new chapter in her book, a story about a woman searching for herself after 20 years of marriage, but her words were slurring, reality mixing with fiction. Her character, Anna, was like her, but Rebecca didn't want that to be too obvious. She wrote a few lines. Anna looked out at the town that had once been her home and knew it wasn't hers anymore. Then she stopped because her thoughts were back on Mark. She remembered their last argument before she left for Maine. He'd been annoyed that she was leaving for the winter, not because he missed her, but because it was disrupting his plans for a dinner party with his partners. "You always run away when you don't like something," he'd said, and she hadn't responded, just packed her bags and left. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Rebecca jumped, put her laptop down, and went to answer it. Luke was standing there, holding a plastic bucket with 2 lobsters in it, still alive and wiggling their claws. His flannel shirt was slightly wrinkled, and there was a slight smile on his face, as if he knew his presence was a slight intrusion, but was confident that he would be forgiven. "Hey, Rebecca," he said, setting the bucket down on the porch. "Caught some this morning, thought you might want some fresh. I can show you how to cook them if you're not afraid to handle the claws." She laughed, feeling the tension ease. "Luke, are you serious? I'm from New York. I only know how to order lobster in a restaurant. But let's try it. Come on in." He walked in, bringing with him the smell of the sea and a slight chill from outside. Rebecca noticed that he moved with confidence, but not intrusively, like a man used to simple tasks, but respectful of other people's space. They walked into the kitchen, where Luke began explaining the proper way to cook lobster: a large pot, water and salt so it tastes like the ocean, and not overcooking so the meat stays tender. While the water heated, he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, and looked at her scattered notes. "You seem to be getting serious about your work," he said, nodding at the notebooks. "What are you writing about? If it's not a secret, of course." Rebecca hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I'm trying to tell the story of a woman who feels lost. You know, when life seems to be going on, but you don't know if it's your life. But it's not working out very well. I keep getting distracted by my own thoughts." Luck nodded, and there was something in his eyes that made her think he was more than just a fisherman with a boat and nets. "I know. It was like that for me when I got divorced. You wake up and think, who am I? You spend your whole life fishing, raising a daughter, paying bills, and then bam, everything you lived for changes. You have to put yourself back together." She looked at him more closely. His voice was calm, but there was a depth to it, as if he'd thought about these things a lot. "You don't sound like a typical fisherman, Luke. No offense, but you sound like you read psychology books." He chuckled, rubbing his chin. "Well, I wasn't always a fisherman. When I was young, I went to college, wanted to be an engineer, build bridges. But life took a different turn. My father got sick. I came back here to help with the boat. Then I got married, had a daughter, and somehow everything started to spin. I read books, yes, especially in the winter when the sea is stormy. I love stories about people who find themselves, even if everything doesn't go according to plan." Rebecca felt warmth from the conversation, from the ease with which he shared personal things without demanding the same from her. She told him about her book, about the heroine trying to figure out what she wanted, and how difficult it was to write when her own life seemed confusing. Luke listened without interrupting, only occasionally asking questions. "What will your heroine choose in the end? Freedom or family?" She shrugged, because she didn't know the answer. While the lobsters simmered, filling the kitchen with the scent of the sea, they moved into the living room, where Rebecca offered coffee. They sat by the fireplace she had lit that morning, and the conversation turned to more personal matters. Luke talked about his daughter, Emily, who was 22, and how he had tried to be a good father even after his divorce. "The hardest thing was letting her into my life. She's in Boston, studying biology, and wants to save whales. I'm proud, but sometimes I think she doesn't need me as much as she used to." "It must be hard," Rebecca said, feeling her own thoughts about family and responsibilities rise to the surface. "Mark and I don't have children, and sometimes I regret it, but at the same time I think maybe it's for the best. we've become distant. He lives for his work, and I live for my books. Sometimes it feels like we're just neighbors, not husband and wife. Luck looked at her with understanding, but without judgment. You know, marriage is like a boat. If you don't both row, it just spins around. I tried with my ex-wife, but she wanted something else, big cities, a career. I couldn't leave, the sea is my thing. What about you? What do you want, Rebecca? The question caught her off guard. She stared into the fire, trying to find an answer, but instead said, I came here to understand this. Sometimes it feels like I'm running from something, but I don't know where I'm going. They fell silent, and the silence was comfortable, requiring no words. The lobsters were ready, and they ate at the table, laughing as Rebecca awkwardly tried to crack a claw. Luke showed her how to properly remove the meat, and in that moment she found herself enjoying his company, simple but genuine. He wasn't like Mark, always rushing around and talking about projects, and it made her think that maybe she missed those moments when she could just be herself. After dinner, Luke left, saying he was heading out to sea early the next day, but offering to show her around at the weekend if she wanted. Rebecca agreed, feeling a little excited, but also anxious. She didn't want to overstep the mark, but she couldn't deny that Luke was sparking an interest in her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Returning to her laptop, she wrote a few more lines. Freedom was scary, Anna realized, but being caged in the familiar was even scarier. Then she closed the computer and went to bed, listening to the wind pounding the windows, thoughts of Mark, Luke, and her own life intertwining like waves on the shore. The next day, she went to the local library, a small building with wooden shelves and the smell of old books. She picked up a couple of novels and a book about the coast of Maine, thinking it would help with the descriptions for her story. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, noticed her accent and asked where she was from. Rebecca said New York, and Dorothy smiled and said, a lot of people come here to get away, but the sea has a way of making people face the truth. The words had stung Rebecca, and she had thought about them all day as she walked along the beach, where the rocks were covered in ice and seagulls circled the water. She remembered trying to talk to Mark about her feelings, but he always steered the conversation toward practical matters, bills, plans, work. She wanted to scream at him to just listen, but she stayed silent, afraid to destroy what was left. Now, away from him, she was beginning to wonder, what if destruction was the only way to grow? By the end of the week, Rebecca had found a rhythm to her days. Mornings writing, walks, evenings with Luke at the bar or at her place. He talked about the sea, about the people in the town, and she found herself looking forward to these encounters. But every time the conversation became too personal, she reminded herself of Mark, of the vows they had made, and of the moral dilemma growing inside her. To be faithful or to be true to herself? The question haunted her like waves that never stopped. The morning in Harborville began with a sharp wind, blowing dry snow down the street and settling on the roofs of the wooden houses. Rebecca woke up in her bedroom, where the smell of pine floorboards mingled with the chill that seeped through the old window frames. She pulled on a warm sweater, made coffee, and sat by the window, looking out at the gray ocean, which looked especially restless today, the waves crashing against the rocks, leaving white foam in their wake. Her laptop lay on the table, open to the same page where she had left off yesterday, but instead of writing, she was thinking about Luca. Their meetings were becoming more frequent, and each conversation left her with a feeling of lightness mixed with anxiety. She didn't want to admit that she was drawn to him. It would be too dangerous, too wrong. But the thought of his calm voice and attentive blue eyes wouldn't go away. Today, Luck had asked her to meet him at the harbor, where he was repairing the nets on his trawler. Rebecca had put on a heavy jacket and driven into the center of town, where it smelled of fish and diesel, and seagulls circled over the pier, calling out their own unintelligible sounds. Luck was standing on the deck of his boat, an old but well-kept one with peeling blue paint on the side. He was wearing a work jacket and rubber boots, and his hands, calloused from years of handling rope, were deftly sorting through the thick net, checking for breaks. "Hey, Ryder," he called out when he spotted her, his voice warm despite the cold wind. "Ready to get your hands dirty? or is it just a keyboard you can type on? Rebecca laughed, stepping closer. You seriously think I can handle this? I don't even know which way to approach this thing. It's a net, Rebecca, not a spaceship, said Luke, jumping off the deck onto the pier. He handed her a pair of work gloves. Put these on, and I'll show you how to fix it. It's easier than it looks, but it takes patience, like with your book, I guess. She pulled on her gloves, feeling a little awkward, and sat down next to him on the wooden bench where the ropes and nets lay piled high. Luck showed her how to find holes, how to weave a new thread so that the knots would hold tight. His fingers moved steadily but deliberately, and Rebecca found herself looking not so much at the net as at his hands, strong and calloused but careful in their movements. Are you always this patient? She asked, trying to tighten the knot, which immediately came undone. I can't seem to do it ever. Patience is from the sea, Luck replied, adjusting her knot. When there's a storm, you don't run home, you sit and wait for it to calm down. If you twitch, you'll only make it worse, and you seem to be used to everything working out right away, huh? Rebecca smiled, but there was something in his words that stung her. Maybe so. In New York, everything is fast work, people, even conversations. There is no time to wait for the storm to pass. But here, everything is slower. It is scary, but also enjoyable. The sea teaches you to wait, said Luck, looking out at the water. You know, we get nor'easters here, storms that shake the houses. I was in one of those once, about 10 years ago, on a boat. The waves were higher than the mast. The wind was howling like it wanted to swallow you. My partner and I fought for 2 hours not to capsize. After that, you start to appreciate when everything is calm. Rebecca listened, her mind off the network. His voice was even, but there was a power in it, as if he were telling not just a story, but a part of himself. How do you deal with that kind of fear? She asked. I'd probably panic. You think about what you have to do right now, he said. Not what's going to happen in an hour, but the next step. Steering, checking the pumps, listening to the engine. If you think about everything at once, you'll go crazy. She nodded, sensing that his words were not only about the sea. Her marriage to Mark was like a storm, only not sudden, but slow, drawn out, with each day bringing a new wave of disappointment. She wanted to tell Luke about it, but instead asked, what do you do when there is a storm inside, when you don't know where to sail? Luke looked at her, and his gaze was so direct that she felt vulnerable. Then you need to find a lighthouse, he said, something that reminds you who you are and what you want. For me, that's the sea and my daughter. What about you? Rebecca didn't answer, just looked down at the net, her throat tightening. She didn't know what her beacon was. Writing? Freedom? Or something else she didn't understand yet. They continued to work, and Luke told stories about the time he'd caught a shark instead of a cod, about how the local fishermen would gather in the winter and argue over whose boat was faster. She laughed, and at one point she caught her hand brushing his as they pulled on the same rope. It was fleeting, but it made her heart beat faster, and she quickly looked away, afraid he'd notice her embarrassment. That afternoon, they finished with the nets, and Luck suggested they go to a nearby cafe to warm up. The salty breeze was small, with faded curtains and tables covered with checkered tablecloths. Behind the counter stood a woman named Carol, who had known Luke since childhood and immediately began teasing him. Luke Johnson, have you brought another stranger into our cafe again? She said, setting 2 mugs of coffee in front of them. Make sure Maggie from the bar doesn't get jealous. Carol, don't start, Luke replied, rolling his eyes but smiling. Rebecca is a writer. She works here, not plays with novels. Rebecca smiled, feeling slightly awkward, but Carol just winked at her. Don't listen to him, dear. He's a local hero, but he's got a soft heart. If anything, come to me for gossip. They sat by the window overlooking the harbor, and Rebecca pulled out her notebook to show Luke some of her sketches for the book. She didn't want to reveal that she was writing about marriage, so she chose a passage about her character, Anna, walking on the beach and thinking about her life. Look, she said, clearing her throat. Anna walked along the beach where the sand was cold and hard, like her own decisions. She knew she had to choose stay with what was familiar or step into the unknown, but every step felt too heavy. Luck listened carefully, sipping his coffee. "Strong," he said when she finished. "Your Anna, she seems afraid, but she doesn't give in. Is that you?" Rebecca hesitated, not expecting such directness. "Maybe a little. Writers always steal bits from their own lives. What would you choose? The familiar or the unknown?" He thought, looking at the harbor, where boats rocked on the waves. "I chose the sea, although it is unknown every day, but it is my choice. And the familiar, sometimes it holds you like an anchor. Do not let you sail further." His words hit her because she felt that anchor mark their marriage, their New York apartment where everything was perfect on the outside, but empty on the inside. She wanted to ask Luke how he'd decided to let his wife go, but instead she changed the subject. "Tell me more about the nor'easters. How do you survive them?" Onion perked up, and they talked for another hour until the cafe began to empty. He told her about the time a storm had blown the roof off his neighbor's barn and how the entire town had come together to help rebuild. Rebecca listened, feeling herself growing attracted to him, not just because of his stories, but because of the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, as if he saw not just a visiting writer, but a person with her own fears and hopes. It was getting dark when they left the cafe, and Luke offered to walk her to the cottage. On the way, they stopped at the pier, where the wind was particularly strong, and Rebecca felt the cold go to her bones. Luke noticed this and took off his jacket, throwing it over her shoulders. "Do you want me to freeze instead of you?" she said, but she didn't take off her jacket, feeling the warmth that still contained his scent. "I'm used to the cold," he replied, smiling, "and you look like you're about to turn into an icicle." They stood by the water, and Rebecca looked up at the lighthouse, its light spinning slowly, cutting through the darkness. Its rhythm was both comforting and unsettling, as if it were reminding her of the time that was slipping away and the decisions she was putting off. She felt Luke standing closer than he should have, and her heart began to beat faster again. She wanted to move away, but she didn't, and it scared her. "Have you ever thought you were doing something wrong, but couldn't stop?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Luke paused, then replied, "Yes. When I realized my marriage was falling apart, I still clung to it. I thought it was my job to hold it together, but sometimes letting go is the only way to move on." Rebecca nodded, feeling a tightness of guilt in her chest. She thought about Mark, how he was probably sitting in their apartment right now, watching the news or working late. She'd called him yesterday, but the conversation had been short. He'd asked how the weather was in Maine and said he was working on a new project. She hadn't told him about Luca, but every time they'd spoken, she felt like she was hiding something, and it made her feel guilty. "I need to go home," she said, handing Luke his jacket back. "Thanks for the day, and the nets, and the coffee." "Whenever you want another fishing lesson, call me," he replied, and there was a slight mockery in his voice, but his eyes looked serious. Back at the cabin, Rebecca lit the fire and sat by the window, looking out at the lighthouse. Its light flickered like a signal she couldn't decipher. She opened her notebook and wrote. Anna knew she was drawn to something new, but every step toward it was a step away from what she had promised to keep. Then she closed the notebook, unable to continue. She felt her attraction to Luke growing stronger, but every time she thought of him, she saw Mark, his face, his voice, their wedding 15 years ago. She didn't want to be the one to break her vows, but she couldn't ignore the way Luke made her feel alive. The next day, she decided to take a break and went to the local market in a nearby town, where farmers sold apples, honey, and homemade cheese. There she met Dorothy, the librarian, who invited her to a book club where local women discussed novels. Rebecca agreed, thinking it would help take her mind off Luke and Mark. At the club, the women, all over 50, were talking about a book, the story of a woman who left her husband for a new life. One of them, Marge, said, "Sometimes I think we stay in marriage because we're afraid we won't exist without it. But that's not true, we're always ourselves." The words echoed in Rebecca, and she returned home, feeling her inner conflict only growing. She wanted to be loyal, but she also wanted freedom. The lighthouse winked outside her window, and she wondered if it was not only showing the way, but also reminding her that some paths were dangerous. The sun was just beginning to break through the thick clouds when Rebecca sat on the porch of her cottage, wrapped in a blanket, holding a mug of hot tea. The air was sharp, with the taste of salt and frost, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks created a rhythm that had become part of her morning. She tried to concentrate on her book, but her thoughts were jumbled onion. His voice, his stories about the sea increasingly occupied her mind, and it frightened her. She did not want to cross the line, but every time they met, she felt her resolve weaken. Yesterday's walk along the pier, with his jacket on her shoulders, left her with a vague sense of guilt mixed with something new, almost forgotten an excitement she had not felt since her youth. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a notification on her phone. Rebecca opened her email and saw a message from Mark. The subject was short, "Coming next week." Her heart sank, and she set her mug on the railing and opened the message. Mark wrote in his usual style, terse, businesslike, as if he were writing a report. "Rebecca, I got tickets for next Friday. I'll be in Harborville by evening. I want to spend the weekend with you, see how you're settling in. Lots of work, but I'll make time. Call if you need anything brought in from town. Mark." She read the letter twice, trying to figure out what she was feeling. Joy? Anxiety? Something else. Mark rarely wrote, much less arrived unannounced. In 15 years of marriage, he had always been preoccupied with his blueprints, his client meetings, his skyscraper projects that would change the face of New York. His visit seemed like a gesture, but what kind? Was he trying to mend their relationship, or was he simply doing his husband's job and saying, "I tried, didn't I?" Rebecca put her phone down and looked out at the ocean, where seagulls dove for fish and a lighthouse blinked its lonely light in the distance. She wasn't ready for him to come, not when her life in Harborville was beginning to take on a new rhythm without Mark in it. She went back into the house and opened her laptop, thinking that work would help her mind. Her character, Anna, was increasingly becoming her alter ego, a reflection of who Rebecca wanted to be or feared to be. She began writing a new scene. Anna, having left her husband in the city, lives in a small house by the sea, where no one knows her past. She goes to the market, chats with the locals, learns to bake bread, and feels free, as if a heavy burden has been lifted from her shoulders. Rebecca wrote quickly, the words flowing, but in every sentence she saw herself, her dreams, her fears. The Anna in her story never looked back, never thought about vows or obligations, and this was both liberating and painful. Rebecca stopped when she realized that she was writing not just a book, but a fantasy about life without Mark. By midday, she was tired, her eyes aching from the screen, and Mark's email was spinning in her head. She decided to call him to clarify the details, but after 3 rings, his voicemail came on. Typical, she thought, throwing the phone on the couch. He was always busy, even when he promised to make time for her. She remembered their last dinner in New York, when he spent half the evening checking his email while she tried to talk about her book. She had felt invisible then, and that feeling was back now, adding to her confusion. There was a knock at the door, and Rebecca, startled, went to answer it. There stood Luke, dressed in a warm jacket and a knitted hat, with a slight smile that always made her feel a little less alone. In his hands he held a small package, wrapped in brown paper. "Hello," he said, holding out a package. "Brought you something. It's smoked cod. Carol from the cafe gave it to you. Said you were too skinny for this winter. You need some feeding." Rebecca laughed, taking the package. "Does Carol think I'm starving here? Thanks, Luke. Come in, I've just made some tea." He came in, removing his cap, his slightly gray hair fluttering in the wind. Rebecca noticed him looking around the room at her laptop, at the scattered papers, at the empty mug on the table. "Looks like you're struggling with a book today," he said, sitting down on the couch. "How's it going?" She shrugged, pouring him some tea. "I'm writing, but I keep getting distracted. I got a letter from my husband, he's coming in a week, and I don't know what to do with it." Luck looked at her carefully, but without pressure. "You don't know whether to be happy or not?" he asked, sipping his tea. "I understand things aren't going smoothly with you and him." Rebecca sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her mug to keep warm. "It's not that it's not smooth. It's just, we haven't been on the same page for a long time. He lives for his work, I live for my books. Sometimes it feels like we've just gotten used to being together, but that's not the same as being close." Luke nodded, his face serious. "I know. When I was married, Kate and I got to that point too. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning to go to sea, and she wanted me to give up everything and move to Portland with her. I couldn't. The sea is my life, and she couldn't stay. Eventually, we both got tired of pretending." Rebecca looked at him, feeling his words echo in her. "And how did you know it was time to let go? I always think I have to try, that marriage is work, but sometimes it feels like I'm the only one doing it." He paused, looking into his mug. "I realized when I stopped feeling like myself around her. You know how you adjust all the time so as not to quarrel, but in the end you lose what makes you alive. For me, it was the sea. I couldn't leave it, even for her. And what's important to you? Writing or something else?" The question caught her off guard. She wanted to say that her book was her beacon, but she thought about how easy she felt with Luke, how he listened to her, how his presence made her feel seen. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But here in Harborville, I'm starting to understand. You make me think of myself differently." Luke smiled, but there was something serious in his eyes. "Be careful, Rebecca. I'm just a fisherman who likes to talk. Don't give me too much credit." She laughed, but felt her cheeks burn. "You're not just a fisherman, Luke. You know that. You have depth. You don't just talk about the sea, you make me see things differently." He put his mug down and looked at her, and a tense silence fell between them. Rebecca felt she should change the subject, but she couldn't look away. Luke leaned a little closer, and she knew he wanted to say something, but instead he stood up. "Let's go for a walk. It's windy today, but the beach is beautiful when everything is frozen." She agreed, pulling on a jacket and scarf. They left the cabin and walked along the shore, where the sand was covered in a thin layer of ice that crunched underfoot. The waves rolled in with a heavy roar, and the air was so cold that your breath turned to steam. Luck walked alongside them, telling them how the shore changed in winter. The rocks were covered in ice, and sometimes you could find frozen seaweed that looked like glass sculptures. "Here, look," he said, bending down and picking up a piece of ice with a frozen strand of seaweed inside. "Nature is like an artist here, something new every day." Rebecca picked up the ice, feeling its coldness through her gloves. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it's a little sad, like something stuck and can't get out." Luck looked at her, his voice quieter. "Sometimes being stuck isn't so bad. The main thing is that you know you can get out if you want to." They stopped at the water's edge, where the waves lapped at the frozen sand. Luke stood close, and Rebecca felt herself drawn to him not just by his words, but by the way he looked at her, as if he saw the real her, not the one pretending everything was all right. She turned to him, and their eyes met. He slowly raised a hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment she thought he was going to kiss her. Her heart pounded, and she wanted it. But then Mark's face, his letter, their vows, flashed before her eyes. She stepped back, looking down. "Luke, I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm married, and I don't know what I'm doing." He nodded, making no attempt to stop her. "I understand, Rebecca. I don't want to rush you. It's just, I like you, and I can see that you're struggling with something. If you want to talk, I'm here." She nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes, but held them back. "Thank you," she whispered. "I need time." They walked back, and the conversation became lighter, with Luke talking about how he had seen whales pass by the shore one winter, and how the locals would gather on the pier to watch them. Rebecca listened, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about Mark, and how his arrival would change her life here. and about Luke, who made her feel alive, but also presented her with choices she dreaded. Back home, she opened her laptop again and wrote another scene. Anna meets a man who reminds her that she has forgotten what it is to want something new. But every time Anna approaches him, she hears her husband's voice calling her back. Rebecca wrote until midnight, until her fingers ached, and then she went out onto the porch and looked at the lighthouse. Its light flickered, cutting through the darkness, and she felt it was saying, "Choose." But she didn't know what to choose: duty or desire, safety or the unknown. The next day, she decided to take a break and went to a local antique store she found in downtown Harborville. It was an old building with sagging shelves that smelled of dust and old wood. The owner, an old man named Jack, showed her a collection of old photographs of the town, taken in the early 20th century. One of them was of a lighthouse surrounded by fishing boats, and Rebecca bought it, thinking it would be part of her book. "This lighthouse has seen many stories," Jack said, packing up the photograph. "People come here thinking they'll find answers, but the sea doesn't give them away. It makes you work." Rebecca smiled, feeling his words resonate within her. "I'm beginning to understand," she replied. That evening she called Mark, and this time he answered. His voice was tired but familiar, and she felt a pang of nostalgia. "I'm glad you're coming," she said, trying to sound sincere. "It'll be great to show you around Harborville." "Yeah, I'm waiting too," he replied, but there was no warmth in his voice, just the usual businesslike manner. "I've got a new project here, a skyscraper in Chicago, so I won't be long, but I want to see how you are." They talked for a few more minutes, but Rebecca felt like there was a wall between them that she couldn't break down. When she hung up, her thoughts went back to Luke, to their walk, to how close they'd been to kissing. She knew she should stop, but her heart was already captured by him, his simplicity, his honesty, his ability to see her for who she was. She went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. The lighthouse winked outside her window, and she thought about how it had stood there for decades, guiding ships but not choosing their path for them. She had a choice to make, and that choice scared her more than any storm. The cold wind off the Atlantic grew sharper, and the sky over Harborville darkened, as if someone had thrown a heavy gray blanket over it. Rebecca awoke to the sound of the wind howling, shaking the windows of her little house, and knew immediately that today would be a different day. The air in her room was damp, smelling of the sea and an approaching storm. She stood up, threw on a warm sweater, and went out onto the porch, where a gust of wind greeted her, throwing small drops of rain into her face. The ocean looked threatening. The waves rose higher than usual, crashing against the rocks with such a roar that it seemed as if the earth were shaking. The lighthouse on the cliff winked its light, but in the morning gloom it seemed weak, almost lost. Rebecca went back into the house, made coffee, and turned on the local radio that sat on the kitchen counter. The announcer's voice, raspy and calm, warned of an approaching nor'easter, a winter storm that could bring high winds and snow. "Get ready, boys," he said. "Secure the boats, check the windows, stock up on firewood. This is going to be no joke." Rebecca felt a little uneasy. She had never experienced such storms in New York, where the biggest inconvenience in winter was the snow jams. Here, everything seemed more serious, closer to nature, which does not tolerate weakness. She opened her laptop to distract herself and tried to write. Her character, Anna, now lived in a fictional coastal town like Harborville, learning to trust herself by listening to the sea. Rebecca added a new scene. Anna helps the locals prepare for a storm, fortifying houses and collecting firewood, and in the process finds the sense of belonging she had missed in her marriage. The writing was easy, the words flowing, but Rebecca knew there was too much of herself in these lines, her doubts, her longing for a life where she could feel whole. She stopped when she realized she was writing not just about Anna's freedom, but also about her own fantasy, a life without Mark. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Luke was standing there, wearing a rain jacket with the hood up, dripping rain. His face was serious, but his eyes were as warm as ever. "Hello, Rebecca," he said, shaking the rain off his sleeves. "Heard about the storm? The town's getting ready to help. Will you come with me? Marge's windows are old and need boarding up, and Carol's is running low on firewood. Rebecca nodded, feeling warmth spread in her chest at his invitation. Sure, give me 5 minutes, she replied, pulling on her warm boots and jacket. I've never prepared for a storm. It's like in the movies, right? Luck chuckled, adjusting his hat. Not exactly. This is all real. But don't worry, we'll get through this. The main thing is to stick together. They walked out into the town, where work was already in full swing. The streets were unusually busy, with men hauling boards, women checking on food supplies, and children running around despite the cold, helping or just getting in the way. Rebecca and Luke headed for the house of Marge, an elderly widow who lived in a small cottage overlooking the harbor. Her windows were old and cracked, and Luke immediately set to work nailing wooden boards to keep the wind out. Rebecca held the boards, trying to keep out of the way, and listened as Marge talked about the storms of years past. One nor'easter in '86 took out half the pier, Marge said, standing on the porch with a mug of tea. We were without power for a week. But you know, Rebecca, storms like that teach you to appreciate what you have. Neighbors become family when trouble hits. Rebecca nodded, feeling her city habit of solitude dissolve in this communal spirit. In New York, we just wait for the snow to be cleared and get mad if the subway is late, she said, smiling. But here, it's more honest. Luck, hammering another nail, looked at her. The sea doesn't let you pretend. It either accepts you or teaches you wisdom. You're holding the board crookedly, by the way. She laughed, straightening the board. Sorry, I'm new. Are you always such a strict teacher? Only with the ones I like, he replied, his voice light but his gaze serious. Rebecca felt her cheeks heat up and quickly looked away, pretending to focus on her work. After Marge's, they drove to Carol's, whose Salty Breeze Cafe was closed because of the storm. She was waiting for them in the backyard, where she had a small pile of firewood, but it was clearly not enough to last several days. Onion had brought a few bundles in his pickup, and he and Rebecca began moving them into the barn. The rain had gotten heavier, and Rebecca could feel her jacket getting wet, but the work was enjoyable. There was something simple, earthy about it that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Carol, standing under the awning, teased them. Luck, are you making your guest carry firewood? Where are your manners? She shouted, but her eyes were shining with laughter. She asked for it, Luke replied, winking at Rebecca. Besides, it suits her. A writer with firewood is something new. Rebecca rolled her eyes, but couldn't help but smile. I told you I can do more than just type, although I admit firewood is heavier than a laptop. When they were finished, Carol invited them into the cafe for hot soup. It was warm inside, smelling of fresh bread and spices. They sat at a table by the window, where the rain pounded the glass, and in the distance they could see the dark waves growing higher. Rebecca watched Luke, who ate his soup with such simplicity, as if it were the best meal of his life, and thought how different he was from Mark. Mark was always on the move, his mind occupied with projects, clients, deadlines. Luke was here, in the moment he lived in harmony with nature, with its rhythms, and this drew Rebecca even more. Have you ever thought about leaving here? She asked, stirring her soup. Like, to the big city, to start all over again? Luck put down his spoon and looked at her. I thought about it when I was younger. I wanted to be an engineer, build bridges. But then I realized that the sea is my thing. It doesn't lie, it doesn't pretend. In the city, I would suffocate. And you? You're from New York, but you're sitting here in the wilderness. What keeps you here? Rebecca hesitated, unsure how to respond. I came here to write, but I guess I also came here to figure out what I want. There's too much noise in New York to hear myself. He nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. The sea helps. It's like a mirror, it shows you who you are if you're not afraid to look. They talked for another hour, and Rebecca told him about her book, not about Anna being herself, but about her heroine learning to live again. Luke listened attentively, asking questions. What would Anna do if she had to choose between the past and the future? Rebecca didn't know the answer, but his interest inspired her. She wrote down his stories about the sea, the time he saved a sinking boat, the whales that came to shore in February, and wove them into her book, mixing them with Anna's fictional life, where there was no Mark, no commitment, just freedom and the sea. As they left the cafe, the rain turned to a downpour, and Luke offered to give her a ride home. His truck smelled of wood and salt, and Rebecca felt cozy despite the storm outside. On the way, he told another story about a nor'easter he'd experienced as a young man when his boat nearly crashed into the rocks. "I thought it was the end," he said, holding the wheel with one hand. "But you know what helped? I remembered my father saying, 'If you're scared, look at the lighthouse. It's always there.' And I looked until I got out." Rebecca looked at him, feeling her heart clench. "Are you always so calm, even before a storm?" He smiled, not taking his eyes off the road. "Calmness is a choice. If you panic, the storm will swallow you up. And you, Rebecca, are you afraid of the storm or something else?" She didn't answer, but his question echoed in her. She was afraid not only of the storm, but of what would happen when Mark arrived. Afraid of her feelings for Luke, which were growing with each passing day, and how they might destroy everything she had spent years building. When they pulled up to her house, Luke got out of the car and walked her to the door, holding an umbrella over her so she wouldn't get wet. "Thank you for today," she said, standing on the porch. "I didn't think storm preparation could be so unifying." "This is Harborville," he said, smiling. "We stick together here. Call me if anything happens. The storm's coming tonight. I can stop by to check on you." She nodded, feeling drawn to him, but held back. "I can handle it. But thank you, Luke." He left, and Rebecca was alone, listening to the wind howl outside. She lit the fire, sat down with her laptop, and began to write, weaving Luke into the book, not as a romantic hero, but as a man at peace with the world, who accepted the storm as part of life. She wrote, Anna looked out to sea, knowing the storm was inevitable, but for the first time she was not afraid. She was learning from those who knew how to stand against the wind. Late that evening, as the wind grew stronger, Rebecca called Mark. He answered, but his voice was distant, as if he was already thinking about the next call. "Are you ready for me to come?" he asked. "I took a couple of days off. We can go to a restaurant or something." "There's a storm coming," she replied, trying to sound neutral. "But yes, I'd love to see you." They talked for a few more minutes, but Rebecca felt a gulf between them. When she hung up, her gaze fell on the lighthouse, its light shining through the rain. She thought of Luca, the way he talked about the sea, the way his presence made her feel alive. But she also thought of Mark, the years they had spent together, and her promise to be with him. The storm was approaching, and Rebecca knew it would bring not only wind, but also the answers she feared. The night before Mark's arrival was turbulent. The wind howled louder and louder, and Rebecca sat by the fire, trying to concentrate on her book, but her thoughts were in a tangle. She imagined Mark walking into her cottage, wearing his expensive coat, his tired eyes, and the constant scent of the cologne she had once loved, but now associated with his aloofness. His letter of arrival still hung in her mind like an uninvited guest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his visit would disrupt the fragile rhythm she had found in Harborville. Outside, the lighthouse winked through the rain, and its light seemed to be her only anchor in the chaos, not just because of the storm, but because of her own emotions. One morning, when the sky was leaden gray and the air was damp, Rebecca heard a car. She looked out the window and saw a black rental SUV parked on the porch. Mark got out, wearing a navy wool coat and a leather bag slung over his shoulder. His urban polish, his neatly coiffed hair, his expensive shoes, the light stubble he called stylish, was a sharp contrast to the rough-hewn simplicity of Harborville, where even the houses seemed carved out of wind and salt. He knocked on the door, and Rebecca took a deep breath and opened it. "Becca," he said, smiling, but his smile was tired, as if he was already thinking about returning to New York. "Well, here I am. The place is unusual, let's say." She forced a smile, feeling her heart clench. "Welcome, Mark. Come in, I'll make some coffee." He walked in, looking around the house with mild surprise. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd choose a place like this. It's like a set for a movie about fishermen. Where's your laptop? Are you writing something great?" Rebecca put the kettle on the stove, trying not to react to his tone, a mixture of condescension and curiosity that always irritated her. "Writing, yes, but just sketches so far. It's quiet here, helps me think." Mark took off his coat and hung it over the back of a chair, looking around the living room. His gaze fell on the table where her notebooks and several sheets of manuscript lay. He reached for one of them, but Rebecca quickly stepped forward and put the papers away in a drawer. "It's not ready yet," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't want to show it yet." Mark raised his eyebrows, but didn't press the issue. "Okay, that's up to you. I just thought you might want to share. You always said I was your first reader." She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Once upon a time, she had shown him everything she wrote, but now her book was too personal, too tied to her doubts about marriage, about him, about Luca. Sharing it would be like opening a door to her soul, and she wasn't sure Mark would even want to look there. They sat down at the table, and Mark began talking about New York, about a new skyscraper project, about meetings with clients, about how his firm had won an award for innovative design. Rebecca listened, but his words seemed distant to her, as if he were talking about another planet. She tried to pay attention, asked questions, but she felt a wall growing between them, invisible, but heavy. "Did you miss me?" he asked suddenly, sipping his coffee and looking at her over the mug. His tone was light, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Rebecca hesitated, choosing her words. "Of course, Mark. It's different here. I'm getting used to the silence, to the sea. It gives me time to think." He nodded, but his gaze grew serious. "Think about what? About us? I know I've been busy, but I'm trying, Becca. This visit, I'm here for you." She wanted to believe him, but his words sounded like a rehearsed line. "I know," she said quietly, "and I'm glad you came. I really am." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Rebecca jumped, feeling her heart speed up. She knew who it was before she opened it. Luke was standing in the doorway, wearing a rain jacket that was dripping with rain. His face was serious, but his eyes were as warm as ever. "Hey, Rebecca," he said, looking past her to Mark, who had gotten up from the table. "Just came by to make sure you were all set for the storm. The wind's picking up. Better make sure the windows are holding." Rebecca felt the air in the room thicken. "Thank you, Luke. This is Mark, my husband. Mark, this is Luke. He's a local. He's been helping me get settled in." Mark extended his hand, but his smile was strained. "Nice to meet you. Onion, huh? Fisherman." Luke shook his hand, his movements calm, but Rebecca noticed his gaze deepen. "Yes, a fisherman. Glad Rebecca found inspiration here. She said you were an architect." "Right," Mark replied, crossing his arms. "I work in New York, designing buildings, and you're here with nets and boats. Pretty exotic." Rebecca felt her cheeks heat up with embarrassment. Mark's tone was polite, but there was a superiority to it that she knew so well. Luke, however, was not taken in. "Exotic if you don't live it every day," he said with a slight smile. "But the sea teaches patience. Rebecca, I checked the windows from the outside. Everything was tight. If anything happens, call. I'm here." "Thank you, Luke," she replied, trying not to look him in the eye for too long. "I'll call if I need anything." He nodded, casting a quick glance at Mark, and left. The door closed, and Rebecca felt the tension in the room not dissipate. Mark returned to the table, but his face had changed. He looked at her with a slight squint. "A local hero, huh?" he said, sipping his coffee. "Do you talk to him often?" Rebecca felt her heart tighten. "He's just a neighbor, Mark. Everyone helps each other out here, especially before a storm. This isn't New York. People are closer here." Mark nodded, but his gaze was sharp. I see. It's just, you look right at home here. It's weird to see, you know. You've always been a city person. She didn't answer, feeling the irritation building in her chest. He'd come here, but instead of understanding what she was going through, he was looking for a catch. She wanted to tell him that she felt alive here, that Onion was helping her see herself in a new way, but instead she just said, "I'm trying to find inspiration, that's all." They spent the rest of the day in the cabin because the rain had turned to a downpour and the wind was so strong it was bending the trees. Mark tried to be loving. He helped her light the fire, offered to cook dinner, but his movements were awkward, as if he were playing the role of a caring husband. They ate pasta with sauce from a jar, and Mark talked about his work, but Rebecca was only half listening, thinking about the way Luke talked about the sea, its calm and honesty. She found herself comparing them, and it made her feel guilty. "You seem distant," Mark said as they sat by the fire. "I thought you'd be glad to see me." Rebecca looked at him, trying to find in his face the man she had fallen in love with 15 years ago. "I'm glad, Mark. It's just, I've been thinking a lot. About us, about what I want. It all becomes clearer here." He frowned, setting his wine glass down on the table. "Clearer? What do you mean? You're not going to stay here forever, are you? This place, it's not for you." She felt a twinge of irritation. "How can you be so sure you know what's for me? You never asked me what I really wanted." Mark paused, his face tense. "Becca, I'm trying. I came here even though I have 3 projects on deadline. I thought we'd spend time together like we used to." "Like before?" she asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "When was that, Mark? When was the last time you looked at me and not at your phone? Or asked me how I was feeling and not what we were having for dinner?" He opened his mouth to answer, but at that moment the lights in the cabin flickered and went out. The wind roared outside, and Rebecca knew a storm had begun. She stood up, found a lantern in the kitchen, and lit it. Mark looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. "It's okay," she said, trying to reassure him. "They warned us that the power might go out. We have a fireplace, firewood, and food. We'll cope." He nodded, but his face remained tense. "Are you really okay here, with this storm, and with this fisherman coming in to check your windows?" Rebecca felt her throat tighten. "Mark, don't start. Onions just help. That's the way it's done around here." "I'm not starting," he said, but his tone was sharp. "It's just, I'm your husband, Becca. I want to know what's going on." She didn't answer because she didn't know what to say. The storm outside was getting worse, and she could feel it cutting them off from the outside world, not just Harborville, but who they used to be. She looked at Mark, trying to see the man she loved, but all she saw was a man who didn't understand her. And in that moment, she thought of Luca, his calm, his stories, the way he made her feel alive. They went to bed in the dark, listening to the wind pound the walls, and Rebecca lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She knew the storm wasn't just outside her, it was inside her, and Mark, sitting in the next room, was part of it. But somewhere out there, in that same storm, was Luke, and the thought of him was both comfort and danger. The storm had hit Harborville with such force that it seemed as if the sea itself had decided to remind the people of its power. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, shaking the walls of Rebecca's cottage, and the windows shook under the onslaught of rain that lashed at the glass like 1,000 tiny hammers. The electricity had gone out that evening, and now the room was lit only by the flickering light of the candles that Rebecca had placed on the table and windowsills, and the occasional flicker of the lighthouse, whose beam pierced the storm like a feeble signal of hope. The air in the house was cold, despite the fireplace, which Mark tried to keep going, adding logs with the clumsy care of a man unused to such tasks. Rebecca sat on the couch, wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at the flames, trying to ignore the tension that hung in the room heavier than the smell of damp wood. Mark sat across from her, wearing a city sweater that looked out of place in the surroundings, leafing through a magazine he'd found on the shelf, an old issue about Maine fishing. His gaze kept falling on her laptop, and the stack of papers on the table that held the manuscript she'd been so careful to hide. Luke, who'd been caught in the storm while he'd brought lanterns and extra candles, had settled into a chair by the window, watching the storm as calmly as if it were an old friend. His presence only seemed to increase Mark's irritation, and Rebecca felt like she was sitting on a powder keg, waiting for a spark. "Damn, this is like a disaster movie," Mark said, putting down his magazine and rubbing his hands together to warm himself up. "Did you really pick this place, Becca? I thought you were kidding about winter in the middle of nowhere." Rebecca smiled tightly, trying not to show how hurt she was by his words. "This isn't the wilderness, Mark. This is life. Everything here is real. The storm, the sea, the people." "Real, huh?" he chuckled, but there was bitterness in his voice. "Real is when you're sitting without light and freezing. In New York, we'd be drinking wine in a restaurant right now, not listening to the roof crack." Luke, who had been silent until now, turned away from the window. "The roof will hold," he said calmly but firmly. "This house is old but strong. And the storm, it teaches you to appreciate when things calm down. The sea always returns calm if you give it time." Mark looked at him, narrowing his eyes. "Poetic. Do you always say that, Luke? Or is that for guests?" Rebecca felt her heart tighten. "Mark, that's enough," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Luke's here to help. We're all in this together, in case you hadn't noticed." Luke raised his hand as if to stop her. "It's okay, Rebecca. I'm used to it. Not everyone understands the sea. It's either yours or it's not." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Well, I'm not exactly the type to fall in love with waves. I build buildings that last for centuries, not just sway in the wind. But Becca, you're not planning on staying here forever, are you? This is temporary, right?" She didn't answer right away, looking at the candle, its flame flickering in the draft. Mark's question wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, an attempt to bring her back to their old life, where everything was familiar but empty. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "I'm here to write, and to understand myself." Mark frowned, his gaze sliding back to the manuscript on the table. "It's about your book, isn't it? You always get like that when you write. Like you're in another world. Maybe you should show me what's there. I'm your husband, Becca." Rebecca tensed, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "I told you, she's not ready. It's personal." "Personal?" Mark asked, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "We've been married 15 years, and your book is personal. What are you writing in there, Becca? About your new life? About him?" He nodded toward Luke, his tone almost accusing. Luke looked up, but his face remained calm. "Mark, I'm here to help with the storm. Don't drag me into your business." Rebecca felt the blood rush to her cheeks. "Mark, stop. It's not fair. Luke is my friend. He's been helping me since he arrived. You don't know how things work here." "A friend, huh?" Mark stood up, his voice growing louder. "I come here to see my wife, and I find her in the company of some fisherman who looks at her as if he knows her better than I do. Do you think I'm blind?" Rebecca stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "You came here, and you didn't even try to understand how I feel. You talk about your job, about New York, but you never asked what's going on with me. And Luke, he listens. He sees me." There was silence, broken only by the howling wind and the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. Luke stared out the window as if he didn't want to intrude, but Rebecca felt his presence like a magnet pulling at her thoughts. Mark, on the other hand, looked confused, his face pale. "See you," he repeated, more quietly, but with pain. "And I don't see you. I'm trying, Becca. I came out here to this dump for you. Remember how we started? How we'd sit at night, planning our lives. I thought we were still a team." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. His words had hurt her because they were true. They had once been a team, dreaming together, making plans. But now she couldn't remember the last time she had felt like herself around him. "We were a team," she said quietly. "But where were you, Mark? You lived your life and your work, and I was just trying not to get lost. Luck coughed, standing up. I think I'll check the firewood outside. You need to talk. He took the lantern and went out, leaving them alone. Rebecca looked at Mark, who was now standing by the fireplace, staring into the fire. Becca, I don't want to fight, he said, his voice tired. I can see that you've changed, and I'm scared that you won't come back. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to hug him, to tell him that everything would be like before, but the other part of her, the part that had found itself in Harborville, knew that was a lie. Instead, she said, I'm scared too, Mark, but I can't pretend that everything is okay. They fell silent, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder. Rebecca looked at the table where her manuscript lay and thought of Anna, her heroine, who chose herself despite her fear. She wanted to take the papers, hide them, but Mark had already noticed her gaze. It's all about us, right? He asked, nodding at the manuscript. You're writing about us falling apart? It's not about us, she lied, but her voice cracked. It's just a story about a woman who's searching for herself. He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe it. I want to read it when you're done. If we're still going to be Luck returned, bringing with him the smell of rain and cold. There's enough wood to last until morning, he said, setting the lantern on the table. But the storm is getting worse. Best to stay inside and keep a low profile. Rebecca nodded, feeling her mind torn between the two men, the one who was her past and the one who was her present. She offered them all tea to ease the tension, and they sat down, but the conversation faltered. Mark tried to talk about the past, about their trip to Italy 10 years ago, about how they had laughed over bad wine in a small cafe. Rebecca smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. Luke talked about the sea, about how storms tested people, but his words seemed to her to be a reference to her own struggle. Do you often find yourself in trouble like this? Mark asked Luke, his voice more curious than before, but still tinged with sarcasm. Every winter, Luke answered, looking at the candle. The sea doesn't ask if you're ready or not, it just comes. But if you know how to hold the helm, it will let you go. Rebecca listened, feeling his words echo in her. She wanted to ask him how he had learned not to be afraid, but instead she remained silent, looking at the lighthouse flickering in the window. The storm had trapped them together, and she knew that this night would change everything, not because of the wind or the rain, but because of a truth that could no longer be hidden. The storm continued, its roar outside the windows of the cottage like the breath of some ancient beast that knew no fatigue. The wind threw handfuls of rain at the glass every now and then, and the flashes of the lighthouse, breaking through the storm, cast ghostly shadows on the walls of the room that danced in time with the crackling of the wood in the fireplace. Rebecca, exhausted by the stress of the day and the weight of conversation, finally fell asleep on the sofa, covered with a blanket. Her sleep was restless, full of fragmentary images, the sea raging under the light of the lighthouse, Onion standing on the pier, and Mark, whose face was dissolving into the darkness, as if he was already a part of the past. Mark was awake. He sat by the fireplace, looking into the fire, but his thoughts were far from the warmth. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, but they were cold, almost alien. His gaze kept returning to the table where Rebecca's manuscript lay, the stack of papers she had hidden so carefully. He sensed that there was a truth hidden within those pages that she did not want him to see, and the thought burned inside him. Once she had shared every line, every draft with him, but now her book was a forbidden zone, and that made him an outsider in her world. Once again, as the lighthouse beam lit up the room, Mark stood up. His movements were cautious, almost stealthy, so as not to wake Rebecca. He walked to the table, picked up the top sheet of manuscript, and hesitated before beginning to read. The lighthouse light coming through the window was weak, but enough to make out her neat handwriting. The words on the page came to life, and with each line his face grew darker. Rebecca wrote about Anna, a woman who fled city life for a small coastal town to find herself. But Mark recognized Anna immediately as his wife. Her way of thinking, her fears, her yearning for something more. Anna lived in a house by the sea, walking the frozen shore, learning to mend nets and hearing stories of storms from a man named Elias. Elias was a fisherman with calloused hands and a calm gaze that saw in Anna not only her past, but also her potential. Mark felt his throat tighten as he realized that Elias was Onion, rewritten in her imagination. But what hurt him most was the absence of himself in the story. There was no husband, no marriage, just Anna and Elias, their walks, their conversations, their growing attraction. He turned the page, his fingers shaking. The Anne in the book didn't look back, didn't remember the vows or the years she'd spent with someone else. She was free, and that freedom that Rebecca had described so vividly cut Mark like a knife. He read until the lighthouse beam disappeared in another wave of rain, and then he put the papers back, trying not to make any noise. But his heart was pounding, and one thought was spinning in his head. She wanted a different life, a life without him. In the morning the storm was still raging, but the wind had calmed a little, and there was hope for a lull in the air. Rebecca woke to the smell of coffee. Luke, who had risen earlier than everyone else, was brewing it on the gas stove he had brought with him. He looked as always, calm, with a slight smile, as if the storm was just another day in his life. Mark was sitting at the table, but his face was different, cold, distant, as if he had put on a mask to hide his thoughts. "Good morning," Rebecca said, rubbing her eyes and trying to shake off the last of the sleep. "The coffee smells like salvation." "Thanks, Luke." "You can't go anywhere in a storm without coffee," he replied, pouring her a mug. "How did you sleep? Did the storm get on your nerves too much?" She smiled, taking the mug. "I dreamed of the sea, as if I was on a boat. But I think it was the wind. And you? You look like the storm is your old friend." Luck grinned, looking out the window, where the waves were still crashing against the pier. "We're on first-name terms. He makes noise, I wait. The main thing is not to argue with the sea, it always wins." Mark, who had been silent until then, cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself. "I wonder how you do it," he said, his voice even but with a subtle edge. "Living as if all this," he gestured around the room, "was normal. No electricity, no proper food, no civilization." Luck looked at him, his eyes calm but attentive. "Civilization is what you make of it. For me, it's the sea, the boat, the people around me. What is civilization to you, Mark?" Rebecca tensed, feeling the air thicken again. Mark didn't answer right away, his gaze sliding to the manuscript on the table, and she saw his fingers curl into a fist. "For me, this is work that changes the world," he said finally. "Buildings that last for centuries, not nets and storms." "Mark, stop it," Rebecca interjected, her voice firmer than she'd expected. "We're all here, and we're all trying to cope. There's no need to make this a competition." He looked at her, his eyes cold as the winter ocean. "I'm not competing, Becca. I'm just trying to understand what you see here, and why are you so protective of him?" He nodded toward Luke. Luke raised his hand, as if to stop the storm that was brewing in the room. "I don't want to come between you," he said quietly. "Rebecca, I'll check the shed. The wood might get wet. If anything happens, shout." He left, and Rebecca felt her heart tighten. She looked at Mark, who was now standing at the table, his fingers brushing the edge of the manuscript as if he wanted to pick it up again. "Is there something you want to say?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "You've been on edge all morning." Mark turned to her, his face tense. "I read your book, Becca, last night while you were sleeping, and you know what I saw? You, but not with me, with him." He nodded toward the door where Luke had been standing. "You write about life without me, about some fisherman teaching you how to live. Is that your plan, to go to him?" Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. She stood up, her hands shaking. "You had no right," she said, her voice quiet but full of anger. "This is my book, Mark. Mine. You can't just pick it up and read it because you feel like it." "I'm your husband," he almost shouted, but then lowered his voice as if he remembered that Luck might hear. "I thought we had no secrets, but you write about leaving me for some..." romantic fantasy hero of yours. This is him, right? Luck is your Elias." Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to compose herself. She felt vulnerable, like her heart was on display. "It's not about Luca," she said, but her voice cracked. "It's about what I want. About freedom, about feeling alive. You don't understand that because you've never asked me what I'm missing." Mark looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that she almost regretted her words. "I thought we were happy," he said quietly. "I thought what we had was enough for you." "I thought so too," she replied, her voice barely audible. "But I'm tired of pretending, Mark. I'm tired of being invisible." He fell silent, and the storm outside seemed to be the only sound in the world. Rebecca looked at the manuscript, feeling her heart torn between the truth she had written and the truth she was afraid to admit. Mark moved toward the window, his back tense, and she knew he would not forgive her for these words. When Luke returned carrying an armful of firewood, he immediately felt the tension. "Everything okay?" he asked, placing the wood by the fireplace. Rebecca nodded, but her eyes were wet. "Yeah, just storm," she said, trying to smile. "Is there any more coffee?" Luke looked at her, then at Mark, and said nothing. He poured her coffee, and they sat at the table, but the silence was as heavy as wet snow. Mark no longer looked at the manuscript, but his coldness was palpable, and Rebecca knew that his discovery had changed everything. The storm outside was not abating, and she felt her own storm raging inside her, ready to break out. The storm continued, its fury seeming to mirror the storm within the cabin. The wind pounded the walls so hard the wooden beams creaked, and the rain pounded the roof, drowning out everything but the heavy silence that hung between Rebecca, Mark, and Luke. The candles on the table flickered, casting long shadows, and the light from the lighthouse, shining through the storm, seemed the only reminder of the world beyond. Rebecca sat on the sofa, clutching a mug of cold coffee, her fingers shaking not from the cold, but from a tension she could no longer ignore. Mark stood by the fireplace, his face stony, but his eyes betraying a storm of emotion, anger, pain, fear. Luke sat by the window, looking out to sea, but his calm, usually so infectious, now seemed out of place, almost provocative. Mark was the first to break the silence, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Becca, stop beating around the bush," he said, turning to face her. "What's going on with you and him?" He nodded toward Luke without looking at him. "Do you think I don't see the way you look at him? The way he looks at you? I read your book. It's not just a fantasy, is it?" Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. She set her mug down, trying to compose herself. "Mark, you're wrong," she said, but her voice wasn't as confident as she'd intended. "There's nothing between me and Luke. He's my friend. He helped me here in Harborville. You can't just accuse me of cheating on you because you thought I did." Mark chuckled, but there was no joy in his laugh. "Friend? Becca, I'm not blind. You're writing about some fisherman who teaches your heroine how to live, who sees her, as you put it. And it's not me, it's him." He pointed at Luke, his hand shaking. "You think I can't see how you come alive around him? How do you smile when he tells you his damn sea stories?" Luke turned, his face calm but a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Mark, I don't want to be a part of this," he said, his voice even but firm. "I came here to help Rebecca with the house, with the storm. If you see me as a threat, that's your thinking, not my actions." "A threat?" Mark asked, his voice growing louder. "You're sitting in my wife's house, drinking her coffee, telling her how the sea teaches you how to live. That's not a threat, that's friendship. Don't make me laugh." Rebecca stood up, her patience snapping. "Mark, stop it," she nearly shouted, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "You can't just barge in here and blame everyone. You read my book without permission, you see what you want to see. Onion isn't the problem. We are the problem. You and me." Mark froze, his eyes narrowing. "We? So now it's my fault? Me, who came here to be with you despite 3 projects burning at work. And you write about life without me, with some other guy, and I'm supposed to just swallow it." Rebecca felt the tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I wrote to figure myself out, Mark," she said, her voice quieter but firmer. "I didn't cheat on you. Not with Luke, not with anyone. But I won't lie, I felt alone. For years, you were busy with your work, your skyscrapers, your meetings, and I was invisible. I came here to find myself, and yes, Luke helped me. He listened, he was there. But it's not cheating, it's just the truth." Mark looked at her, his face slowly changing, the anger giving way to something else, perhaps recognition. "Lonely," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "You never said you were this bad. I thought, I thought we were making it. I tried, Becca. I always tried." "You were trying for yourself," she replied, and her words were like a blow. "You were building your career, and I was proud of you. But where was I in all of this? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When did you notice that I was drowning in my loneliness? I wrote Anna to understand who I was without you, because I lost myself next to you." Luke, who had been silent until now, stood up. "I'll let you talk," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." He took the lantern and walked away, leaving them alone with the crackling fireplace and the howling wind. Rebecca looked at Mark, who was now leaning against the table, his shoulders slumped. "Do you really think I didn't see you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I knew you were unhappy, Becca, but I thought it was temporary, that you were writing your books, that you just needed time. I didn't know you felt so empty." She nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "I tried to talk, Mark, but you didn't hear. You were too busy to notice. And here in Harborville, I began to feel alive. Not because Luke was some hero from a novel, but because he reminded me that I could be myself. Not your wife, not a shadow of your projects, just Rebecca." Mark sank into a chair, his face pale in the candlelight. "So what now?" he asked, looking at the floor. "Do you want to leave? To him? Or just leave?" Rebecca paused, her heart pounding. She didn't know the answer. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that they could fix this, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "I don't know, Mark, but I don't want to lie to you or to myself anymore. I didn't cheat on you, but I can't pretend that everything is okay." He nodded, his eyes blank. "I didn't want to lose you," he said quietly, "but I guess I already did, huh?" Rebecca didn't answer because she couldn't. She felt the storm inside her reaching its peak, and the truth she'd kept inside for so long was finally spilling out. Mark looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, not anger, not accusation, but the realization that their marriage was like an old house, cracking under the force of the storm, and he didn't know how to save it. There was a rustling sound outside the kitchen door. Luke was probably fiddling with the gas stove, trying not to interfere. Rebecca knew he had heard their conversation, and that made her even more vulnerable. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him it was not his fault, but instead she just sat there, staring at the candles burning low on the table. The storm outside was still raging, and she felt like it was a mirror of her own life, chaotic, out of control, but perhaps leading to something new. Morning came quietly, as if the storm had exhausted itself and decided to retreat. The wind died down to a whisper, and the rain became a drizzle, leaving behind only puddles and the smell of wet earth. The light from the lighthouse, which had fought the darkness all night, seemed brighter now, its rhythmic flashes filtering into the cottage, illuminating the room with a soft, almost comforting light. Rebecca awoke to the silence that comes after a storm, when the world seems fragile but full of hope. She lay on the couch, still covered by the blanket, listening to the rain drip from the roof, her thoughts swirling around her conversation with Mark the night before. Mark sat at the table, staring into his empty mug. His face was tired, but not as cold as it had been the day before. The tension that had torn them apart the previous day had subsided, leaving behind only weariness and a desire to find some way forward. Luke was in the kitchen, his footsteps almost inaudible, but Rebecca could feel his presence, like a beacon that was always there, even when you weren't looking. "Good morning," she said quietly, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. The storm seems to have passed. Mark nodded without looking up. Yeah, the silence is deafening after all this. He paused, then added, Becca, we need to talk. Not about him, about us. Rebecca felt her heart clench, but she nodded. I know. I don't want it to end, Mark, but I can't go back to the way it was. He looked at her, his eyes a mixture of pain and determination. I don't want to either. I've been thinking about it all night. I was blind, Becca. I really thought it was okay that you were happy. But now I see how wrong I was. I want to try again. Not for the same old thing, but for something new, if you're ready. Rebecca paused, looking at the candles that had burned to the ground. His words were sincere, but she knew their marriage would never be the same. She wanted to believe they could build something new, but part of her still yearned for the freedom she had found here in Harborville. I don't know if it will work, she said honestly, but I'm willing to try, if we're both honest with each other. Mark nodded, his face softening. I want to hear you, Becca. Not just your words, but you. I promise I'll try. Their conversation was interrupted by the creak of the door. Luke came out of the kitchen, holding his jacket in his hands. His face was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. The storm has died down, he said, looking at Rebecca. I think I should go. I need to check the boat, the shed, and anyway, you need some time. Rebecca felt a pang in her chest. Luke, you don't have to go, she said, but her voice was quieter than she intended. You've helped so much. He smiled, but it wasn't as easy as usual. I know, Rebecca, but sometimes it's better to leave before things get complicated. You're strong, you can handle it. With the book and everything else. He turned to Mark and nodded. Take care of her, he said simply, without challenge, but with a firmness that made Mark look down. Luke put on his jacket and walked out, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the storm. Rebecca walked to the window, watching his figure disappear into the morning mist, heading for the boathouse. She noticed a folded piece of paper on the table. She unfolded it and read, Rebecca, thank you for the time we spent together. You reminded me that the sea is not the only thing that can teach us about life. Write your book, it is real. If you are on the shore, I will always be there. Onion. She clutched the note in her hand, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't run after him, didn't call him back. She knew he was right to leave. But his words, simple and honest, stayed with her like a beacon in a storm. By midday, Rebecca and Mark had packed up. The storm had left destruction in its wake, fallen branches, a flooded pier, but the road into town was open. They climbed into Mark's car, and Rebecca looked one last time at the lighthouse, which now shone in the clear sky. She knew she was going back to New York, but her heart was here in Harborville, amid the salt wind and stories of the sea. Their life in the city continued, but not as before. She and Mark went to a family therapist, talked about what they had lost and what they could still save. Sometimes Rebecca caught herself thinking about Luca, about his calm, about the way he looked at the sea as if it were part of his soul. But she didn't call him, didn't write to him. She kept his note as a reminder of who she could have been. Rebecca returned to her book with renewed determination. She rewrote the ending. Anna, her heroine, did not choose either man. Instead, she stood on the shore, looking at the lighthouse, and understood that her strength was within herself. The lighthouse in the last scene became a symbol of her inner freedom, her ability to move forward despite her fear. Rebecca finished the book sitting in her New York apartment, but in her mind she was on the shore, where the waves whispered of the beginning of something new. One evening, while Mark was in a meeting, Rebecca sat down at her desk and wrote a letter to Luke. She had no intention of sending it. It was for herself to close the chapter. Onion. I don't know how to thank you for showing me who I am. Your stories about the sea, your gaze, your voice, they helped me find myself. I didn't choose you, but I didn't choose the past either. I chose myself. Thank you for the light you gave me, even if you didn't know it. Rebecca. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer next to his note. The beacon she had seen in her dreams continued to shine, not to guide her to someone, but to remind her that she could be her own guide. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.